Okay, Unit 6, Lesson 6, and this one is going to be on the quadratic formula. So it's really, as you'll see from the worksheet, so if you open the worksheet that I have put on Moodle, you'll see what it talks about. So it just explains the quadratic formula. So it says in a note, when a quadratic function is given in standard form, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, when trying to find the x-intercepts, we factor, and then of course we use the null factor law, or the zero product property. However, sometimes the function cannot be factored. Now what's important here, if it cannot be factored, this doesn't mean that the function has no x-intercepts. It just means that the numbers might be a little messy and they won't come out in factors. Okay, so if you're trying to find x-intercepts and you can't factor it because you can't find the numbers, there is an alternative way to do it, and this is called the quadratic formula, and you'll see the formula is written there at the end of that first note. So it goes like this. The quadratic formula is, to find the x-intercepts, you need to do minus b. So b is going to be the number in front of the x. It's the x coefficient, okay? So you take minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a, which is the x squared number, the x squared coefficient, c, which is the constant at the end, and you divide all that by 2a. Now that looks a lot more complicated than it actually is, so I'm going to show you how to apply it, right? So if you look at task 1, there's 4 problems. I want you to attempt to plug those in and see how you get on, and then watch what I do. Now there's a procedure here. You have to follow this closely, right? You have to be careful to follow what I'm showing you accurately, or you will make mistakes. First one, right? So we have y equals 6x squared minus 12x plus 1. So we're going to use our formula, and I need to identify what a, b, and c are. So first I'm going to say that a is my x squared coefficient, which in that case is 6. B, we don't put the x squared or anything like that, it's just the number. B is my x coefficient, which is minus 12. We have to take the minus into account. And c is my constant, which is 1. Now I'm going to apply the formula. So the formula tells me that x equals minus b. So if b is 12, minus b, if b is minus 12, that means that b is positive 12. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. Now look, put this minus 12 in parentheses. If you don't put that in parentheses, it will give you the wrong number. We're squaring negative 12. Minus 4 times a, which is 6, times c, which is 1. Okay? All over 2a. So the first step, this is what I want you to do every time. Just replace the letters with the numbers and do it accurately. Then, the next thing I want you to do, you see this piece in here inside the square root. I want you to evaluate that. Now you can do it with your calculator, that's fine. We're going to have 12 plus or minus. Now, whatever is inside the square root, don't put the square root over it, just whatever's in the square root, put it into your calculator. So you're going to get minus 12 squared, which is 144. You're squaring a negative, getting a positive. Minus 4 times 6 times 1, so it's 144 minus 24, so it's 120. All over 12. Now, at this point, the plus minus in the middle means you have 2 possibilities. So you're going to break it up into 2. You're going to go with 12 plus the square root of 120 over 12. And also you're going to do 12 minus the square root of 120 over 12. So let's have a look. How will that go? So you move this up a little bit. So you go to your calculator. And in your calculator now, you're going to type 12 plus the square root of 120 equals, okay, it's going to give you an answer, and then press divided by 12. So it's going to give you 1.91. Let me see, get my pen. Okay, so the first one there is equal to 1.91. And the second one, you're going to do 12 minus the square root of 120 and then you get an answer, and then you divide that by 12. And that's going to give you 0.087. Okay? And now what you have there are your x-intercepts. Alright? So just follow that procedure carefully. Now I'm going to do the next one. Number 2. And in number 2, I'm going to identify really quickly my A, B, and C. A is 2. B is 5. C is 9. And it's negative 9. Right, let's start plugging things in. So our x-intercepts are given by minus 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared. I don't have to put the 5 in parentheses now because it's not a negative. Minus 4 times 2 times minus 9. All over 2a. Okay, first step, please always do this. Just replace the letters with numbers. Now the next thing we're going to do, we're going to evaluate inside the square root. Put it in your calculator carefully. You're going to get 25 with 5 squared. And you're going to get 25 plus 72, so 97, the square root of 97. All over 4. Now, at this point, we break it up into 2. We're going to get minus 5 plus the square root of 97 over 4. That's my first x-intercept. And minus 5 minus the square root of 97 over 4. That's my second. Excuse me. So now let's evaluate them really quickly by just putting them in our calculator. You have to put them in very carefully. So I'm going to do minus 5 plus square root of 97, and then hit equals, and then divide that by 4, and I get 1.21. Okay, so 1.21, first x-intercept, and then I'm going to do minus 5 minus the square root of 97, and divide that by 4. So we can see minus 5 minus root 97. Okay, divided by 4 equals minus 3.7. Minus 3.71. Okay, 3.71. So there you go. There are your 2 x-intercepts for that function. Alright? And that's all there is to it. So you try the rest of them. Just be careful. Be careful to follow the steps as I've shown in the first 2 sections. Okay, so task 2 provides us with something a bit interesting. So we're going to see a couple of interesting situations that come up. So it gives us y equals 6x squared minus 12x plus 7. And it asks us to find the x-intercepts. So if I look to see if I can factor that, I need 42 when I multiply and minus 12 when I add, and that's not possible. So I go straight to the quadratic formula. So my a is 6, my b is minus 12, and my c is 7, plus 7. Okay, so the quadratic formula tells me that the x-intercepts are minus b. So b is minus 12, so minus b is positive 12, plus or minus the square root of b squared, minus 12 squared, minus 4, times 6 times 7, all over 2 times 6. Okay, so that gives me 12 plus or minus. Now remember I said evaluate, and the reason I ask you to evaluate under the square root here very carefully, this you're going to see why this is important now. So if we put that, what's in under that square root into our calculator, what we're going to get is 144 minus 168, which gives me minus 24 all over 12. Now, what's happened here that's a problem? Well, what's happened is we have a negative in the square root. So that means that in the process of trying to find x-intercepts, we got a minus inside the square root, which we know that is impossible, it doesn't make sense. So we can't go any further, and that means that there are no x-intercepts. So a negative square root gives us no x-intercepts. Alright? So at that point you can just stop and just note down no x-intercepts. All right? Okay, task 3. This presents us with another interesting one, right? So let's try and do this one. So again, we have A equals 3, B equals 6, C equals 3. So what we're going to have now is to find our x-intercepts, x equals minus b, so minus 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So that gives us minus 6 plus or minus the square root of, and if you put that in your calculator, you're going to see you have 36 minus 36, which is 0, all over 6. And look what happens. Because we end up with 0 in the square root, it's minus 6 plus 0, and minus 6 minus 0, which just gives you minus 6. So it's minus 6 over 6, so it's just equal to minus 1. So how many x-intercepts does that give you? It just gives you 1. Okay? So, let's have a look at why this happens. So what's really important when you're doing the quadratic formula, you'll see that there's the piece under the square root, which is the b squared minus 4ac. Okay, that's under the square root symbol. And that's very important for us to understand how many solutions there are going to be, or how many x-intercepts there are going to be. And here's the reason why. This thing here, the discriminant, if this is a negative number, so if we say if this is negative, that means we're going to have a negative number under the square root, and that means there's no solutions, which means no x-intercepts. Okay? So when your discriminant is less than 0 or it's negative, we have no x-intercepts. Now, what will happen if my discriminant is equal to 0? Well, if it's equal to 0, that means that inside the square root you're going to have 0. So the square root of 0 is 0. And that means you're only going to end up with 1, because you're going to have plus or minus 0, which is only going to give you one solution, so one x-intercept. Okay? And the very last situation is where we have the discriminant is positive. So it means you have a positive number in the square root symbol. And when you have a positive, the square root of a positive number will always have two possible outcomes. So for example, the square root of 9 will be 3 or minus 3. Okay, so because that gives you two outcomes, it means there's going to be two solutions. So 2 x-intercepts. There you go. So that's the discriminant. So now it asks you at the end of it, I'm going to leave you to do it yourself, at the end of task 4, write 3 new quadratics. The first should have 2 solutions, the second should have 1 solution, and the third should have none. And you'll know because you can check by doing the discriminant, by doing b squared minus 4ac, and checking, is it positive, negative, or 0? And then lastly, task 5, you'll see on that worksheet, it asks you to find the key characteristics of the quadratic function and sketch it. So basically what's going to happen here is you're going to try to factor that first to get x-intercepts, and it's not going to work. So you're going to know you have to use the quadratic function, the quadratic formula, to get the x-intercepts. Then you find the y-intercepts, the vertex, line of symmetry, and you do a sketch. Okay?